When talking about dinosaurs, you may have heard words like hadrosaur, theropod, archosaur, ornithischian, but it might not always be clear what words like this mean. Sure, you know Stegosaurus and Triceratops, but you might be wondering what these confusing concepts have to do with your favorite dinosaur. Take Tyrannosaurus rex, for example. Is it a hadrosaur, a theropod, an archosaur, an ornithischian? Are theropods archosaurs? Are hadrosaurs theropods? What about sauropods and thyreophorans and marginocephalia? These words may all sound like Greek to you, and, well, a lot of them are, literally Greek. These words are the names of dinosaur clades, or animal groupings. You may be familiar with mammals, reptiles, rodents, birds, primates. These groups of organisms are called clades, used to organize all living things, plants and animals, living and extinct, based on how they're related. This is called phylogenetics. Phylogenetics is used to study the relationships between living things by tracing their evolutionary ancestry. Speciation occurs as two populations of a species get separated for whatever reason, say by a mountain range or continental drift, for example. The two populations then go on interbreeding amongst themselves, isolated from each other, and over time evolve into separate species. Evolution is a very slow process, of course, so they will still look similar for a long time, even as they gradually become more noticeably different and adapted to their separate environments. Importantly, one species can only split into two. If one of these groups splits into two populations and speciates again, you'd say these two new species are more closely related to each other than to the other one. And of these three groups, you'd say the original species is their common ancestor, which is probably extinct at this point. Remember, this all takes millions of years. To visualize this, we use a chart called a cladogram. Get it? Cladogram? This concept is why we can say wolves and coyotes, within the canine clade, are more closely related to each other than to horses, but as mammals, they're more closely related than they are to iguanas, which are reptiles. Mammals and reptiles have a common ancestor a few 100 million years ago. This clade is called the amniotes. If you go far enough back, animals have a common ancestor with plants. At this point, we're talking a couple billion years. You can see that the further back the common ancestor is, the more distinct the organisms become as they've had more time to evolve and differentiate. So that's the basic idea behind phylogenetics. And we're here to talk about one clade in particular, the Dinosauria. In the early 1800s, when paleontology was a brand new area of study, there were three large extinct reptiles known to science: Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, and Hylaeosaurus. Anatomist Richard Owen noticed similarities between these three and decided to name them as a group of related animals, coining the term dinosaur. That's usually translated as terrible lizard, but for Owen's intentions, it should probably be more like awe-inspiring reptile. Anyway, dinosaurs, or the Dinosauria, were officially recognized by science. Their defining anatomical features included things like their fused sacral vertebrae and their proportions and articulations of their limbs. These shared features, or synapomorphies, are what Owen used to define the clade. Phylogenetics came later. Under these conventions, you'd define the Dinosauria as the most recent common ancestor of Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, and Hylaeosaurus, and all of its descendants. This means you have to assume that at some point in the distant past there was one species that split into two and kept speciating, eventually resulting in these three, and everything in between, every offshoot along the way, and every species that has evolved since. The official phylogenetic definition has since been updated, but I'll get to that later. Now, before we dive into it, keep in mind, these animals are tens, if not hundreds of millions of years old, and the data is based mostly on painstakingly measuring their fossilized bones. With modern animals, we can analyze their DNA to see how they're related and who their ancestors were. It's a lot harder with ancient extinct animals, so we're pretty confident about most of the major groups, but a lot of stuff is still unclear and under lots of study and debate. Some of this information could change and become outdated. So as it turns out, Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus are more closely related to each other than they are to Megalosaurus. In other words, they have a more recent common ancestor. Owen's definition, based on their synapomorphies, includes Megalosaurus, so the common ancestor must be farther back on the phylogeny. This common ancestor was the original dinosaur. We don't know this exact species from the fossil record. Our knowledge of its existence comes only from the logic of how speciation works. But we do know, based on fossilized remains of close relatives, that it was a small bipedal reptile, most likely carnivorous, from approximately the middle Triassic of what is now South America. It was Pangaea at the time. The official phylogenetic definition of what a dinosaur is this species and every animal that descended from it. But just to paint a slightly broader picture, let's take a quick look at where this guy came from. As I mentioned earlier, the mammals and reptiles diverged from their common ancestor about 320 million years ago in the Carboniferous period. This is oversimplified, but I'll highlight the important parts. Everything descended from here is a reptile. About 250 million years ago, the group that currently contains snakes and lizards branched off from the dinosaur ancestry. This group also includes the now extinct mosasaurs. Then, this group diversified into what would become turtles and the group called archosaurs. Archosaurs are defined as the group containing the most recent common ancestor of the dinosaurs and the crocodilians, and all of its descendants. Besides the crocodilian group, pterosaurs are the most closely related to the dinosaurs. But remember, dinosaurs are defined as all the descendants of the most recent common ancestor of Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, and Hylaeosaurus. Everything downstream of this species is a dinosaur, everything outside is not. Therefore, pterosaurs, crocodiles, and mosasaurs are not dinosaurs, contrary to common misconception. Now, enough about what's not a dinosaur, let's get into the phylogeny and major groups of dinosaurs. Usually, people talk about three major groups of dinosaurs: sauropods, theropods, and ornithischians, the longnecks, meat-eaters, and everything else. But remember, phylogenetic clades can only be split into two. Traditionally, dinosaurs are split into saurischians and ornithischians, placing sauropods and theropods together into the saurischian group. In other words, saurischians and ornithischians split apart, and then the saurischians split into sauropods and theropods. Saurischians and ornithischians are differentiated by the arrangement of their hips. Superficially, they resemble the hips of lizards and birds, respectively. Try to guess which ones evolved into birds. It might not be the one you'd assume. In the Triassic, all dinosaur species were pretty close to their basal form. Basal means they're still closely related to and resemble the ancestors they descended from. Further down the line, you'd say they're more derived. When the sauropod and theropod lineages split apart, the two groups still looked pretty similar: bipedal, relatively small, and fairly long necks. At this point, true sauropods hadn't evolved yet, so this group is called sauropodomorphs. As separate niches were available, early sauropodomorphs evolved to become omnivorous, then herbivorous, leading the theropods with their ancestral carnivory. You may have heard of prosauropods. This is kind of an outdated term describing the basal bipedal sauropodomorphs. A couple of early branches, Plateosauridae and Massospondyllidae, split off from the true sauropods in the late Triassic. They lived up through the early Jurassic, but that's about it. Then we have the true sauropods. You know these guys, huge, four-legged, long-necked herbivores. By the Jurassic, they were everywhere, and there were tons of them. Well, one individual would be tons of sauropod, but you know what I mean. Mamenchisauridae were pretty basal in terms of Jurassic sauropods. These are known for their extremely long necks, even by sauropod standards. Then comes the Diplodocodidae. This group contains, you guessed it, Diplodocus. Also such well-known sauropods as Brontosaurus and Apatosaurus. A separate clade within the Diplodocodidae is the Dicraeosaurs. These are often relatively small and known for having the shortest necks of all sauropods. Sister clade to the Diplodocodidae is the Macronaria. These are characterized by their more boxy skulls and generally more upright posture than the previously mentioned sauropods. Camarasauridae is a basal macronarian group, and then the Brachiosauridae. More derived are the Titanosaurs. Sauropods in general are known for being huge, but Titanosauria contains the hugest. Not just the largest sauropods, but the largest dinosaurs, and in fact the largest animals ever to walk the earth. However, it is also worth noting that Titanosauria was a pretty numerous and diverse group, even in terms of size. It also contains some of the smallest sauropods. Titanosaurs outcompeted the Diplodocoids and Brachiosaurids during the Cretaceous and lived all the way to the end of the Mesozoic. While many Jurassic sauropods and even some Titanosaurs have been found on every continent, by the late Cretaceous they pretty much only lived in the southern hemisphere. At that time, they were largely replaced by Ornithischians, especially hadrosaurs, as the large herbivores in the northern continents. We'll get to Ornithischians and hadrosaurs a little later, but first, the other major group of saurischians, sister to the sauropods, is the theropods. Dinosaurs are ancestrally carnivorous, that is, their defining common ancestor ate meat. After the Triassic, as they diversified to fill different niches, theropods were the only group to maintain that. All sauropods and ornithischians were herbivorous. Theropods also maintained their ancestral bipedalism. So, if a dinosaur walks on two legs and eats meat, it's a theropod. Though some notable exceptions did eventually evolve herbivory by the Cretaceous. The earliest theropods look like their recent ancestors, small, gracile, long-necked bipeds. Coelophysis is certainly the most well-known example of this type of basal theropod. One controversial exception is the Herrerasauridae. These were obviously carnivorous and looked like dinosaurs, but based on a handful of skeletal features, might have evolved before the sauropod-theropod split, making them more basal saurischians, or even more basal archosaurs outside the dinosaur lineage altogether. Triassic phylogenies are tough because there's a lot of gaps in the fossil record. So coelophysoids were the main group of definite theropods known from the Triassic. The earliest diverging theropod group from the Jurassic was the Ceratosaurs, a basal group of which is its namesake, the Ceratosauridae. More derived ceratosaurs in the Cretaceous evolved into the abelisaurs. These are the large southern hemisphere theropods known for their short snouts and even shorter arms. After the ceratosaurs comes the carnosaurs and coelurosaurs. Carnosauria splits into megalosauria and allosauria. Megalosauria, of course, contains megalosaurids, which include Megalosaurus itself. You'll remember this as one of the first known dinosaurs. In fact, Megalosaurus was the first dinosaur recognized by modern science. If you removed it from the phylogeny with the original three, theropods, and with them all saurischians, including sauropods, would not be considered dinosaurs. Pretty big deal. Sister to the Megalosauridae, still within Megalosauria, is the Spinosauridae. These theropods are known for their long skinny snouts and inferred piscivorous or fish-eating diet. Spinosauridae is split into Spinosaurinae and Baryonychinae. Allosauria, of course, contains the late Jurassic allosaurids as well as the Carcharodontosaurs, which dominated in the early Cretaceous as some of the largest carnivores ever to walk the Earth. By the late Cretaceous, they continued to thrive only in the southern hemisphere, perhaps following their large sauropod prey. Tyrannosaurs are an early diverging group within the coelurosaurs. Basal members were relatively small, but they evolved throughout the Cretaceous to become larger and replaced the Carcharodontosaurs as the apex land predators in North America and Asia by the end of the Mesozoic. Compsognaathidae were much smaller theropods emerging in the late Jurassic and living mostly through the early Cretaceous. As coelurosaurs became more derived, feathers became an increasingly common feature. Around this point, you'll start to notice the groups generally evolving to more closely resemble modern dinosaurs, which are still alive today. I am of course talking about birds. The next group are the ornithomimosaurs, whose name appropriately means bird mimics. The ornithomimids had the same basic body plan as ostriches, with their long necks and long legs adapted for running. This is one of the theropod groups that evolved omnivory, or possibly even herbivory. The dinochirids, also within the Ornithomimosauria, took this a step further with their highly derived body plans and specialized adaptations, lending to their fully herbivorous diet. Sister clade to the Ornithomimosaurs is the Maniraptora. The Alvarezsaurs are often placed as the most basal Maniraptorans, though this is sometimes disputed. This group contains some of the smallest dinosaurs, and they're known for their diminished hands bearing one large claw and long skinny snouts. These are usually thought of as insectivorous adaptations. The Therizinosaurs are another highly specialized group of large-bodied herbivorous theropods with their long claws and strange vertical posture. Up to this point, theropods had exhibited relatively rudimentary feathers like downy coverings and simple quills. The next group of Maniraptorans, called Penaraptorans, are named for the pennaceous feathers that began to appear on their limbs and tails. These stiff, interlocking feathers are what we still see today on the most derived dinosaurs, birds, allowing them to fly. Most basal of the Penaraptora are the Oviraptorosauria. Oviraptorosaurs were not capable of flight, but their feathers had many other uses. For example, there is fossil evidence that they used the feathers on their arms to cover and protect their eggs. Sister to the Oviraptorosauria is the Paraves. This group contains the Dromaeosaurs and Troodontids. Dromaeosaurs are the small to medium-sized carnivorous theropods known for the large sickle-shaped toe claw that they likely use for hunting. They're generally thought to be fast runners and sometimes theorized to hunt in groups. The South American Unenlagians, with their proportionately longer legs and snouts, are usually classified within the Dromaeosauridae. Troodontids were somewhere between dromaeosaurs and birds. They had the sickle toe claw, but it was diminished, and they were generally smaller and more gracile than dromaeosaurs. It is unclear whether they were more closely related to dromaeosaurs or to birds within the Paraves. Archaeopterygidae is right around here. This is the group that contains Archaeopteryx, the famous missing link between dinosaurs and birds. This is kind of an oversimplification of the phylogeny, and there is some debate over the classification and origin of birds. Suffice to say, birds are here on the family tree. I should point out that Archaeopteryx and other basal birds began their distinct lineage in the late Jurassic. So while their closest known relatives, the Dromaeosaurs and Troodontids, are known from the Cretaceous, they actually split apart considerably earlier. This means that, along with the pterosaurs, small feathered birds were also flying around alongside their fellow dinosaurs throughout the second half of the Mesozoic. And when the big asteroid hit and wiped out most of the life on Earth, survival of the fittest carried on, and in this case, birds were the only dinosaurs fit for the new environment. Their small size and their ability to eat the bugs and seeds that remained in the aftermath being their key to survival. The scientific name for birds is aves. This is why, when people want to talk about dinosaurs but not birds, you might hear the term non-avian dinosaurs. Remember earlier when I said the phylogenetic definition of Dinosauria has been updated since being based on Richard Owen's original 3? Well, this is a good time to bring that up. Birds were traditionally considered a separate class even as it became understood that they descended directly from dinosaurs. As science has advanced and phylogenetic taxonomy has become the norm over outdated concepts, this no longer makes sense. Remember, anything descended from the original ancestor is a dinosaur, and that absolutely includes birds. In order to clearly define the clade Dinosauria to include all extant dinosaurs as well as maintain all the traditional groups, 2 new representatives were chosen. Birds, specifically the house sparrow, to represent the Saurischians, and Triceratops for the Ornithischians. The common ancestor of these two is still the same ancestral dinosaur based on Megalosaurus, Iguanodon, and Hylaeosaurus. The definition is just a little tightened up to reflect modern scientific concepts. So this brings us to the other major dinosaur group, the Ornithischia. If you got long necks, meat eaters, and everything else, Ornithischians are the everything else. Known from the Jurassic and Cretaceous, these beaked herbivorous dinosaurs are known for having all kinds of spikes, horns, crests, and armor. Bipedal, quadrupedal, and sometimes in between, Ornithischians range greatly in size, some even contending with sauropods by the end of the Cretaceous. But what about the Triassic? How did we get from the original carnivorous ancestral dinosaur to this exclusively herbivorous group? Silosaurids certainly seem to fill this gap. These Triassic archosaurs were relatively small with fairly long necks and had a seemingly transitional stance from bipedal to quadrupedal. Silosaurids ran the dietary gamut from carnivorous to insectivorous to herbivorous, which makes it tempting to place them here, but like most things Triassic, the fossil evidence just isn't conclusive enough. They may be basal Ornithischians, or they may not be dinosaurs at all. The most basal major group of definitive Ornithischians is the Heterodontosauridae from the Jurassic. These were small, bipedal dinosaurs with many transitional features you'd expect to find in basal Ornithischians. Their back teeth were adapted for chewing, an important feature in their more derived relatives, but they also had front teeth that suggested possibility of omnivory. Then we get to the main groups you may be more familiar with: Sauropoda and Thyreophora. Sauropoda is the not-so-clever name combining Ceratopsia and Ornithopoda. Within Sauropoda, ceratopsians are closely related to the pachycephalosaurs. These two groups combine to form the Marginocephalia, characterized by a bony shelf at the back of the skull and are ancestrally bipedal. Pachycephalosaurs maintained their bipedality and evolved in the Cretaceous to develop their famous dome-shaped skull roofs. Basal ceratopsians were small and facultatively bipedal, meaning they could choose whether to walk on 2 legs or all 4s. Originating in Asia, they spread across the northern hemisphere, and by the late Cretaceous, the derived ceratopsids had evolved in North America, their large heads forcing them into obligate quadrupedality. Ceratopsidae is known for their elaborate frills and horn ornamentation. This group is further split into Centrosaurinae and Chasmosaurinae. Their horns are pretty all over the place, but a good rule of thumb is Centrosaurines have a large nasal horn and spikes on the frill, while Chasmosaurines have prominent brow horns and long spikeless frills. The other half of the Sauropoda is the Ornithopoda, known mostly from the Cretaceous. Ornithopods didn't have any horns or spikes and are sometimes thought of as just big, boring herbivores, only there to feed the theropods. But they were obviously successful because there was a lot of them. To generalize the ornithopod phylogeny, picture the duck-billed hadrosaurs and basically a gradient of more basal ornithischians leading up to them. Ornithopods started out, as you might guess, small and bipedal, like the Hypsilophodontidae in the early Cretaceous, and just got bigger and bigger. Iguanodon is right in here, until we reached the true hadrosaurs in the late Cretaceous. By this point, they were truly massive and had all but replaced the sauropods in the large herbivore niche in the northern hemisphere, as mentioned earlier. True hadrosaurs, or the Hadrosauridae, are split into two groups. The Lambeosaurines, those that generally had big hollow crests on their heads, and Saurolophines, which were mostly crestless. Sister to the Sauropoda is the Thyreophora, the armored dinosaurs. Thyreophorans are known for having bony growths, or osteoderms, on their bodies that got more and more exaggerated and developed into defensive shields and spikes as they evolved. The Stegosaurians are a well-known group of medium to large-sized herbivores, typically with 2 rows of vertical plates and spikes down their backs. They were most prominent in the Jurassic until they were pretty much replaced in their niche by the other Thyreophorans, the Ankylosaurs, which were successful throughout the Cretaceous. Ankylosaurs were usually covered in a bony shield of osteoderms all down their backs, sometimes with spikes protruding in various spots. Ankylosauria is usually divided into 2 further groups, the Ankylosauridae, which are often known for the big club at the ends of their tails, and the Nodosauridae, which were clubless. Our old friend Hylaeosaurus fits in here. And that's the Dinosauria. You can see how Hylaeosaurus, Iguanodon, and Megalosaurus have been used to define this group of animals, and how the modern definition using Triceratops and modern birds leads to the same common ancestor. Now, I should point out, paleontologists don't always agree on everything, and there is always debate and new studies coming out. The fossil record just doesn't make things obvious. For example, the Chilesaurus has traits of both theropods and basal sauropodomorphs, but it also shows compelling evidence that it was an ornithischian. A mix of these traits could make sense in a basal dinosaur from the Triassic, but Chilesaurus was from the late Jurassic. A similar case is the Jacopele, resembling a basal thyreophoran. It's small and bipedal and looks like it could be the early ancestor that gave rise to the Stegosaurs and Ankylosaurs, except that it was from the late Cretaceous, long after these groups split apart and after the last Stegosaur went extinct. There are also entire groups causing paleontologists headaches, like the Megaraptorans, theropods that might be closer to the Carcharodontosaurs and Allosaurs, or might be basal tyrannosaurs. And remember the Ankylosaurids and Nodosaurids with their clubbed and clubless tails? A recent study completely flipped that on its head, and there's basically no satisfying organization to it. Needless to say, this is a huge oversimplification of what we know about dinosaur relationships and evolution. But even if some details remain unclear, looking at the phylogeny using cladograms like this can show the big picture. Like how sauropods or stegosaurs would necessarily be included even though they're not directly mentioned in the definition, as they are still descendants of the common ancestor. You can see how closely or distantly members of each group are related, and why birds aren't just descended from dinosaurs, they simply are dinosaurs. And pterosaurs, crocodiles, and mosasaurs are not. The Dinosauria are a fascinating group of animals whose family tree started with one small bipedal reptile and branched out over hundreds of millions of years to become one of the most successful groups to ever walk the planet. As their diversity has been the key to their survival to this day, it is the same diversity that continues to pique our interest in studying these ancient animals from large to small, carnivorous and herbivorous, clawed, horned, spiked, and feathered. Hopefully now you have a better understanding of the phylogeny and major groups of the amazing animals that we call the dinosaurs. Hey everyone, I'm glad you're enjoying these unexpected dino lessons. If you're as passionate about dinosaurs as I am, consider checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/unexpecteddinolesson. When you join, you'll be able to request your favorite dinosaur to be featured, and it'll be up on social media within a few days. You'll also get exclusive previews of upcoming content, dinosaurs, and art not yet posted anywhere else on the internet. I really appreciate the support, and again, that's patreon.com/unexpecteddinolesson.